So let's turn our attention now to the rise and use of English. Um, let's think of it first in just in terms of culture. There has been a massive dominance of English, for instance, in tourism. Um, a quick funny story. When I was 19 years old, I had just enough money to travel to either London or Bangkok. And I, I, I wanted to go to Bangkok more, Thailand, but I was afraid that if I flew there, that nobody would speak English, that I would just be completely lost and it would be a miserable experience. So my friend and we chose London instead, and London was miserable. It was cold and rainy. It was a terrible time to go. And, about 6 years later, I wound up going to Thailand for the first time and was shocked at how stupid I was. Actually, everyone was speaking English. There was no trouble at all. And I saw, Europeans are communicating with everyone in English. I did not realize how prevalent English had become. Um, you can also see it with a graph I have on the side with just how many websites are in English. More than half of the World Wide Web is English, followed next by Russian. Um, it is an English internet for the most part. You go to certain social media things like Twitter, it's overwhelmingly English. I have a lot of Filipino friends on Facebook. They post in English, right? You also see it with international business, that if you want to be a successful international business person today, you have to speak English. We see it in media. Um, you know, a lot of us kind of grew up with the same TV shows and some of the same music. When I met my wife, who's Filipino, I was surprised. We listened to the same music growing up. Her favorite band was Garbage. She at least had heard of some of the music that I used to listen to. We both grew up watching The Simpsons. She actually learned her English from The Simpsons. Um, it English carries a powerful cultural weight. Let's look at it in education. Um, as a medium of instruction, you see it in many former colonies. It often serves as a sort of pidgin language, right? So, like you go to a place like India, there's so much linguistic diversity in India that it kind of serves as a bridge between everyone else. They're all speaking it as a second language, but it's how they communicate with each other. It's also a medium of instruction for the most prestigious international schools in a lot of places. Um, it's also worth looking at it in the context of China. English is required for both the Zhongkao and the Gaokao. Now, there's talk of reform, of making it not as required. What I see and how I critique that is that actually they're only talking about reforming it first for the top schools, so it'll be less of a requirement for people who are already very good at English. You see a massive shadow education sector focusing on English as a second language. That's what brought me to China in the first place, right? There's huge growth in this. You're starting to see it as a medium of instruction for some college majors. Not for entire universities, but I think that law, finance, a few other ones at some schools, they're switching over to English as the medium of instruction for those majors or the classes in those majors. Um, there's also a term that I coined that no one else uses, but hey, feel free to use it. I call it virtual English. And what I mean by this is I have been shocked by how many people I have met who have studied English for 5 years, for 10 years, and they do well on tests, but they can't speak it at all. When I did my research in Chengdu, I would meet kids. They've been studying English for 5 years, and you say, "Hi, what's your name?" And they just freeze. They can't answer. And my response to this is that maybe they're not learning real English. They're learning a virtual English. What I mean by this is that maybe it's like if you play a game where you fly airplanes or drive cars all the time, and even you can become very, very good at that game. And the game is something. There is knowledge there. But it's not the same thing as driving a car or flying an airplane. That you can master a game of flying airplanes, but if I put you in the seat of an airplane, you would crash and burn. I've noticed a secondary kind of thing where even people who do speak very good communicative English, they typically don't do well on the college English test. So whatever it is that the CET, this college English test, and the Gaokao and the Zhongkao are measuring, I think it's a little bit different from normal English. Hey, write a paper about that if you want. I'd love to see people explore it. Um, it's worth looking at the rise of English and science. Um, the story of the 20th century is not so much the rise of English as the serial collapse of German as an up-and-coming language of scientific communication. That means that there's a lot of science being done in German. What happened was World War One. There are a lot of German speakers in America as of World War One, and in the early 20th century, about a third of scientific research was being published in German, a third of it in English, a third of it in French, and then it stopped, and Americans only started publishing in English, and the world followed, and now it's just dominated by English. Um, Before English and before German, people communicated with Latin for science. So, for instance, if you read Galileo and these earlier scientific works, they're all written in Latin. People didn't speak Latin. Latin was a written language, right? Um, but that's what people would learn in schools, and that's how they would write their scientific papers. Let's take a look at English and science as a form of scientific communication. And we see on the left, it's the global science research publications. We see, I would say, just focus on the top five of America, China, England, or the UK, and Japan. And what we see is the US is punching very, very well for its weight. It's producing about 1/5 of the scientific research in terms of publication, but it's producing a third of the citations. Look at China. It's the exact inverse. They're producing 10% of science publications, but only 4% of citations. You look at the UK, they're punching exactly at their weight, right, but a little bit higher. They produce 7% of the research, but get 8% of the citations. Japan, it's similar, but a little bit the inverse, where they produce 6% of the publications, but only get 5% of the citations. What's going on here? I think two things are happening. Um, First, I think there's a lot of publications in China that are in Chinese, and I think they are invisible to people who do not speak Chinese, right? So all this knowledge being produced in China, it's only being consumed in China. I think a lot of it, though, is being translated over into English, but I think you get the secondary issue of you're trying to write in a foreign language, and it's difficult, and it's just not going to be as easy, right? So maybe it's that American research, that it's their game, it's their language, it's their culture. It's just easier for us, right? And it, when you write the rules of the game, you know the styles, maybe the history is better. You can just write a better paper because you wrote the rules. I think that's what's happening. Um, let's move over to the issues of language and power. And here I'm using an example from David Graeber. David Graeber did his PhD in Madagascar. And right here he's giving an example of where he went into an office and the office was closed at what he thought was an unreasonable hour. And he was trying to talk to the person in Malagasy, which is the local language. And the guy would only keep responding back to him in French. And he notes that in Madagascar, the local term for French is actually it's a language of command. And he's trying to argue here, remember when we were looking at the Filipino paper and the code switching, that the local language, Malagasy, was a language of negotiation and nuance and explanation. And French wasn't. French was the language of command. French was how you give orders, right? That it was something that officials speak down to other people with. It's worth asking whether or not English is kind of the same thing. I'll give you a minute just to read the quote. All right, let's move into a term called linguistic imperialism. And I'll just read the quote. Seen in its simplest terms, language imperialism involves the transfer of a dominant language to other peoples. The transfer is essentially a demonstration of power, traditionally military power, but also in the modern world economic power, and aspects of the dominant culture are usually transferred along with the language. In view of the prestige of the dominant language and its culture, the transfer may not be imposed, but actually be demanded by the peoples who adopt the dominant language. Remember those examples we were looking at in the Philippines. It is likely to be regarded as intrinsically superior language and accorded alleged virtues, e.g. that it is more logical, more beautiful, or easier to learn. We saw all of this with the Philippine example, how people were resisting having to use local mother tongues as a medium of instruction. They wanted the English, right? They even argued English is our mother tongue. Um, I think it's worth thinking about English in the colonial context of Hong Kong. Is it a language of command? Is it more prestigious? You know, why do people use English in different contexts, right? Is English considered more logical than Cantonese? Is Cantonese for conversation and song, but English is for law and for academic paper? Think about these issues. Also think about this issue. Most of you spent an extraordinary amount of time learning my language. I have spent very little time learning your language. You were expected to learn my language. I was not expected to learn your language. This is basically the root of linguistic imperialism. How is it that some languages are given this platform, and what comes with that? How does that make people look at their own languages and their own cultures, and how do they look at other languages and other cultures? Let's turn to the example of the British Council. This is from a Guardian piece. It says, British policies in Africa and Asia have aimed at strengthening English over promoting multilingualism, which is social reality. Underlying British ELT have been key tenets: monolingualism, the native speaker as the ideal teacher, the earlier the better, etc., which the same book diagnoses as fundamentally false. They underpin linguistic imperialism. Personally, I really question this idea of the native speaker as the ideal teacher. My wife has faced a lot of racism as a Filipino trying to be an English teacher. The funny thing is, I think she speaks English better than I do, or at least many of my family members do. She actually has a more neutral accent than my mother. When I was teaching English, I would go to her as the go-to guy when people would ask me very difficult English questions. She would always be able to say what the grammar rule was. I never learned English like that. I learned it just at the dinner table, at home, watching media, right? I didn't actually have to learn it as a class, as rules. We would learn this later, but it was different. The class discussion we weren't able to have. Is English a language of command? In Hong Kong, does English have more prestige? Is it more logical? Is it superior? More advantages? And again, what I was saying, what sort of advantages do I have as a native speaker of English that others like you will never have? I have a lot of white privilege. I was probably given this job 20-30% for the fact that I can, easily write and communicate in English. It's just not a barrier to me at all. All of my colleagues think that it's so much easier for me. It very well might be. Does you learning English make me and Western people more powerful? No easy answers to this, but they're worth thinking about.